Hello and welcome to Main Mother Matriarch. My guest today is Marco Del Giudice. He's Associate Professor in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of Trieste in Italy, and he is an expert in a research area we spoke about today, evolutionary psychopathology. So that is how our evolutionary history influences mental illness. So we spoke about how gender differences in personality manifest in psychopathology. So the fact that women tend to be somewhat more neurotic than men, somewhat more agreeable than men, all of these personality differences that we went through, how this plays out when we're talking about extremes of human experience in the forms of mental illness. So we spoke about depression, anxiety, also how the postpartum period affects women's minds, anorexia and bulimia, OCD, phobias, all sorts. It was really, really interesting. This has long been a fascinating topic for me. The extended version of the episode, as ever, is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find all the other good stuff associated with the podcast, including the writing that I do, bonus episodes, the chat community, etc. Marco, should we start by talking about the key personality sex differences or cognitive sex differences, and then we can go on to how that translates into psychopathology. So what are the big ones that we know about in terms of how men and women differ psychologically?
All right. Well, so here's one. Depends on the level of analysis that you take. So that's an interesting. I think it's useful to start from there. If you think about personality differences, you can take a really big picture view, and then the biggest differences would be in traits that have to do with, let's say, emotional reactivity, especially negative emotions. So there would be neuroticism or emotional stability in the big five traits, right? That's the main one. Then there's a sex difference in let's say, the agreeableness trait, where you have women tend to be more, to say, trusting, forgiving, in relationship, less antagonistic. And that's the agreeableness part. And that's pretty much it at the level of the big five, because then you find very small differences in things like, conscientiousness, maybe openness to experience, but those very small. And even the bigger ones, like the sex difference in neuroticism, is maybe half a standard deviation. So that's not huge. You still get a lot of overlap between men and women in terms of personality when you look at these traits. Now, where do things get interesting? They get interesting at this lower level of analysis. So if you look inside these bigger traits, you can look at what personality psychology calls facets or aspects, and there are different ways of calling it. But basically, if you move to, for example, narrower aspects, for example, you look at extraversion, like people who are more extroverted, introverted. Now, you don't find the real sex difference there if you consider extraversion as one big trait. But if you kind of look inside, you see there's two main ways of being extroverted. And one is being extroverted in the sense you just like being around people. So being sociable and kind of outgoing. And then there's a component of extroversion that has more to do with asserting yourself. So being at the center of attention, being socially assertive. There's a bit of dominance there. And in these two dimensions, you actually find sex differences in opposite directions. So one way to talk about it is that men and women, yes, they're more or less equally extroverted on average, but they have different ways of being extroverted. And one is more tilted toward dominance and assertiveness. The other is just, being sociable and enjoying company of others. And there's similar things when you look at aspects of, say, openness to experience, where if you distinguish between more imaginative openness to, people who like aesthetic experiences, art, imagination, and people who are more curious, but more in terms of learning about stuff, kind of the more systemizing aspects of that. And then you find sex differences too there. Also within neuroticism, there's a bunch of things in negative emotionality. There are some aspects that have to do with anxiety and sadness, aspects that maybe have to do more with how angry you get, how irritable, and you find differences too. So let's open up these big boxes, the big five, you find more interesting differences and even larger differences sometimes. Then there are some other models of personality that, for example, one is called the 16PF, It's kind of an old-fashioned model people still use in some areas. And there's one trait there, it's called sensitivity. And there you find huge differences, really large differences. And that kind of, personality dimension has to do with essentially being, let's say, tough-minded, interested in whatever objective stuff, not very empathetic, that kind of, tough-mindedness versus being sensitive, interested in aesthetics, empathy, interested in, how others feel, and so on. And this dimension kind of seems to capture most of what's going on in terms of sex differences. The Big Five doesn't have that. And there's a bit of a debate whether, the Big Five kind of more or less intentionally or implicitly kind of slices personality up in a way that kind of minimizes or hides sex differences in a way. But you do recover that if you take aspects of the Big Five and instead of looking at them one by one, you aggregate them into a profile. And that's been one of my, one contribution probably to sex differences, starting to measure sex differences in the aggregate and not just one trait by one. And when you do that, the difference become much, much larger. So these, huge overlap you see when you consider only one trait, it kind of it gets amplified. So the main things I would say have to do with, depending on the model, but it has to do with the emotional reactivity and kind of stability, especially with negative emotions, especially anxiety, sadness, and things like that. There's definitely something about empathy, how, empathy and caring versus antagonism. And there's definitely something about dominance and the more, say, overt and aggressive sides of competition, where you have a sex difference. And different personality models kind of put these things in different boxes. On the cognitive side, well, it's also an interesting, very interesting and controversial area. Now, general idea is that when you look at something like IQ or general intelligence, so the standard line is that you don't get sex differences. So sexes are equal on IQ. Turns out there's probably a little difference there as well. I mean, it's still kind of, I wouldn't say 100%, but I think most of the data do show that after adolescence, you actually get maybe, 3 points, 4 IQ points difference that favors males. So that's, it's not huge. I mean, it's definitely not a big difference, but, it's kind of there. And it does. So it's exactly kind of the right amount of difference in IQ that you would expect based on differences in brain size, which is another very controversial thing because males tend to, they have bigger bodies. They also have bigger brains. Turns out that the size of the brain is not just because of the bigger body. So it's actually, it's incremental. So it's a bit disproportionate. So the more brain that you would expect just based on the body size. And kind of the mystery was why you have larger brains, but no differences in IQ. Because IQ is also correlated with brain size. So there seems to be a little puzzle there. And turns out when you run the calculations and consider all the, the strength of the correlation and the confounding effect of body size and everything, basically you get, the prediction is that you should have some maybe 3-4 points of IQ differences, which is what you find. So it's probably no big mystery there, but it's not a big deal in the sense that on average, you don't even see that unless you have a very large group of people. So if you're on a large group of people, maybe you start noticing it. But if you have, in a small group, you don't even see a difference of that size. Where you do have a difference is in the variability. That's where people get really, let's say, excited in good or bad ways about this. But that's one of the traits where men are more variable. So you find more. That applies to brain size too. So you find more men at the low end. So the closer you get to mental disability, intellectual disability, the more males you find with respect to females. So it's definitely male bias, and it gets more male bias as you move down. Then you have some syndromes where you have big genetic syndromes that maybe strike both sexes equally, but on average, that's what you get. And you get the same pattern when you go to the upper side of the curve. So you go the very high IQ levels. The more you go toward the upper end, the more males compared with females you find, and that's where it gets, of course, incendiary. I don't know if you want to talk more about this.
my audience can cope with that, Fat Marco. Don't worry.
I'm sure.
We know this.
I'm sure. But many other audiences are extremely disturbed. But it's interesting because, it's what makes this particular pattern of sex difference so incendiary is that it's hard to explain with kind of environmental influences that would just push one sex to one side or the other. Because then you would expect like an average difference. Differences in variability is like, how's that supposed to work? And what kind of effect, environment would make men not just say smarter at the high end, but also dumber at the low end? So that's why it's kind of not so easy to, explain away if you want to explain it away. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard to just view it as socialization.
Yep. And then then again, if you look at specific abilities, I mean, the big story very quickly is if you start, controlling for the, let's say, general kind of ability, how smart one is on average, then men are better at like visual spatial tasks that involve, again, processing visual information, spatial information, rotating shapes and that kind of stuff. The biggest difference actually is not in visual spatial per se, but in like mechanical reasoning. If you have two problems involving, I don't know, forces, levers, that kind of stuff, that's where you get the biggest differences. And on the other side, women are better at all the verbal aspects of intelligence, which includes a lot of stuff. So, for example, some mathematical tasks and items, actually, they have more of a verbal component, because the way you solve them is not by imagining, shapes and things, but it's by, processing information in a kind of more verbal way. So verbal is not just about, I don't know, sentences and phrases. There's a bunch of things. Musical processing as a so-called verbal component as well. But that's a big difference. And then you see, again, the narrower you get, the more you get to smaller and smaller facets, you see other interesting things going on at a lower level. But, as a big picture brief, I think we covered it.
So I'm familiar with the greater male variability when it comes to IQ, and indeed other traits where you just see more variability among men. The bell curve is kind of flatter and longer, right? But then it just occurred to me, do you see that in the big five as well? So do you see so a trait like neuroticism, which we're going to talk a lot about, I imagine, because of its relevance to psychopathology. Do you see, let me try and explain it without a diagram. So we know that the female bell curve is maybe half a standard deviation or a bit less further towards the high neuroticism.
Yes.
But which would make you assume that the right tail is going to be very female. So the really neurotic people are going to be overwhelmingly female, because you see these differences most clearly at the tails. But then I just wondered if there's greater male variability in personality traits, including neuroticism, maybe you wouldn't see that, because maybe actually men would have fatter tails than you'd expect.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Well, yes, it does. Absolutely. And what you see, so it's harder to measure personality objectively than something like IQ or intellectual abilities. So it depends, the exact results depend on whether you get self-reports, rating by other people. So, personality is a bit squishier and there's way more measurement error in there. That's another issue, because, the nice thing about, say, an IQ test is that it measures whatever it measures, right? This kind of general ability it does very precisely. So you can see differences in the variation in two groups. Personality is a bit trickier for a number of reasons, but in general, what you see is a bit more variability in most traits, with the exception of neuroticism. So neuroticism is actually a trait where not only females are higher, but they're also a bit more variable than males. So the upper tail of neuroticism is definitely female dominated. So there's no compensation from more variance in males. Yes.
Interesting. I first started thinking about this carefully during COVID, when I noticed, do you remember, particularly kind of earlier on in COVID, I certainly observed people who on the street were very, very visibly agitated about social distancing,
Yes.
and would like leap off the it was sort of funny in a dark sort of way, people who would leap off the pavement into the road to avoid walking too close to someone on the pavement. And my husband and I called these pavement jumpers. And
were you deliberately
and
jumping at them from behind?
People being really, really, really twitchy
Yes,
about transmission, and I noticed that they were overwhelmingly women, at least in my anecdotal experience, they're overwhelmingly women. And I did think, well, maybe it's because women are, say, more likely to be caring for elderly relatives, and so they're more anxious about transmitting it to older people. Or maybe, I tried to come up with social explanations, and then I thought, actually, maybe it's just because that right tail neurotics, the right tail neurotics are mostly women, and actually, you just see this, therefore, visually. That's when you're encountering people who are very anxious.
Let's put it, the other way around, because neurotic. I mean, things like the big five, right? Neuroticism is a descriptor. It's useful in some ways as big, descriptor of something that you see in people, the way, people maybe talk about other people or themselves. But it's kind of more interesting to take a step back and think about the kind of process, the psychological processes that make you, let's say, more or less, what's the meaning of it? What does it mean to be, highly neurotic? Because, on a descriptive level, yes, I mean, you have more negative emotions. Maybe they go up and down more. That's not very psychologically rich, what I'm saying. And so one way of thinking where actually an evolutionary perspective gives you some leverage, thinking about all those things, is to consider the costs and benefits of self-protection in men and women. So the idea here is that many negative emotions like anxiety, fear, right, but also sadness to some extent, but also things like disgust. So there's a number of emotions that you can understand them better if you think of them as ways to protect yourself. So they're defenses, right? Anxiety is, defense against possible potential dangers. Disgust is, contamination and other things. Fear, obviously, some kind of imminent threat. And what's the calibration of these defenses that you want to have? Because of course, I mean, if you just want to maximize how safe you are from all sorts of, shame is something that protects you from, being ostracized and rejected by your group or other people. So all these negative emotions, most of them have a kind of self-protective and defensive side to them. And the issue is, okay, how much of that do you want? And the answer is, well, it depends, because the more, if you want to be absolutely protected from all sorts of dangers, then there's a huge opportunity cost. Because then it means you're going to, explore less, take fewer risks. If part of what you're doing is, say, I don't know, going out and fight or do other dangerous activities, well, you don't, that's going to hamper you if you have all these kind of protective emotions. And so the idea is that essentially the calibration of these emotions, the optimal level is different for men and women. So if you frame things in this way, you can think of neuroticism as, like the psychometric kind of trace of essentially just being more sensitive to danger and having a whole bunch of protective mechanisms that are more sensitive and have a lower threshold for becoming activated. And so, for example, and that's interesting because that leads you to some of the big differences in psychopathology, where essentially you see that all the disorders where negative emotions are the main thing, the main aspect of the symptoms, which means depression, anxiety, most anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety, but also panic disorder, phobias, right, specific fears, PTSD, which is it's interesting to describe, but PTSD is essentially what happens after you experience something that's very high levels of stress and threat. At least you perceive that this way. All these disorders are biased toward women by maybe one time and a half, 2 times, 3 times, depending on and then there are some finer distinctions you can make, but by and large, all those things are more represented. Women are more, let's say, sensitive to a number of negative emotions. There's probably an upside to it because it actually protects you from physical danger, but also social dangers, like rejection and so forth. And the price you pay is you're more open to, excessive levels or dysregulation in those mechanisms. So all the disorders that can come from that. It also cuts across some disorder. For example, if you look at disgust. So disgust, there are pretty big sex differences there, depending on what kind of disgust for what. But even if you take like the most basic form of disgust, which is for things that are, potentially contaminating, right? So a disgust for like dirt, feces, bad smells, weird patches on the skin, all things that people find disgusting, right? Women are more sensitive. They it's easier to get this. I mean, this is very commonplace thing. But the interesting thing is that fits into some phobias, because, for example, phobias that involve blood, blood injections, but also like small animals like rats, spiders, insects. I mean, if you look into the emotional correlates of that, it's not really fear, but that's not the main thing. But the reaction that people have, there's a lot of disgust reaction in there, and you find that women are much more likely to develop these kind of phobias. And when you look at something like OCD, right, where people have obsessions and rituals and all that kind of stuff, overall, that's, you don't find any big sex difference in OCD. But if you start looking at the symptoms, and the main things you have in OCD is like symptoms that involve like cleaning and contamination, right? Versus things that have to do with checking that everything's all right, like protection in that way. And then you have all the, say, religious, sexual, aggressive kind of obsessions where you think you might be doing something wrong or bad or hurt somebody. Okay, the big difference is you find that in the contamination symptoms, where again women tend to get much more of that. So it's interesting because once you start thinking about you don't start from psychopathology or personality trait, but you start a bit more from mechanisms. For example, different emotions and how they might be regulated differently in men and women. Then it gives you an interesting perspective of why. So it's not just about depression, right? You start thinking of disorders that involve exaggerated or heightened, self-protection from some kind of danger. There you find a very consistent difference with women having more of that and more severe forms.
That's so interesting. You know what it reminds me of is paraphilias, which I guess are sort of a type of psychopathology. But I did an episode with Ray Blanchard last year, I think, about this. And in general, it's exactly as you say. It depends on which categories you're using. Because in general, men are much more likely to have paraphilias than women. But there are some things like masochism and hybristophilia, so sexual interest in dangerous men, basically, criminals, where women are much, much more likely to manifest them than are men. And it's because it's not that, even though in general women are less likely to have unusual sexual interests, those are examples of ones where women, they are actually basically exaggerated versions of normal female sexuality.
Right.
So you could say, I guess you could say again that having a contamination, a form of OCD where you're obsessed with contamination, is in a sense an exaggeration of normal female psychology, almost.
Right. I mean, yes. I mean, males have it too. So it's not, again, it's not like it's a binary thing in that sense. It's really about sensitivity and levels. Of course, I mean, now sometimes quantity turns into quality. So, you can start off from something that's look more like an average difference. So it's not like a category difference. It's like, just being more sensitive or less sensitive, but in certain situations, especially when things get stuck into some kind of self-reinforcing loop, then you go from something that's a bit dimensional, and so maybe you have a bit more of that, but then you cross a threshold, and then it becomes a different in quality, if you see what I mean. And COVID definitely brought it brought out a lot of that as well, in terms of the whole contamination threats and so forth. Yes,
absolutely. We would expect the pavement jumpers to be women from an evolutionary perspective.
But I think the message is there's two ways of talking about sex differences and psychopathology, right? One is the epidemiological kind of approach. So you start, listing disorders and saying, okay, this is more males, this is more females, and that's the standard way in which it's done. So, and I think it's the complementary ways to start from how males and female psychologies are actually different, and how that actually, the offshoots of that are what lead males and females to have different rates of psychopathology. And then, of course, in interaction with the environment, not all about evolved predispositions. There's conditions too. But you make sense of a lot of things much, much better if you start thinking about things like the role of, say, aggressive or competition for status. And then you get into, all the, disorders that have to do with, or so-called disorders, because now that, maybe we call them disorders, they're not, nothing is malfunctioning, but we, just don't like them from a social or personal perspective. That's another big debate. But let's say, all disorders have to do with unchecked aggression or, disruption, conduct disorders, all the way to psychopathy and antisocial. Of course, I mean, that's also very male biased. You find a big sex difference there. It's easier to understand if you think of the role of open aggressive competition in males and females, the self-protective role of certain emotions, and then there are differences. For example, regarding cognitive abilities that sometimes maybe feed into some of those. So it's just, you take things from kind of the bottom up, from the aspects of evolved psychologies of males and females. You can actually reconstruct the big patterns of differences in psychopathology in a way that maybe hopefully makes a bit more sense.
Thinking again about neuroticism in women.
Yes.
You spoke about basically that it's a completely rational way for women to behave because of women being more vulnerable. And I was wondering, can we tease apart the extent to which this comes down to women being smaller than men, and at risk and less physically strong, and at risk of sexual violence in particular, and how much it's to do with childbearing? Because obviously the mother baby dyad is extra vulnerable, even compared with just the childless woman. Can we see, for instance, peaks in neuroticism when women have just had children? Could this explain a lot of postpartum psychopathology, that it's this exaggerated experience of vulnerability?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a great. So, okay, stepping back 1 second, I mean, when you start thinking about, how things like those evolve, I mean, they don't evolve, they evolve in packages.
Yeah.
So it's not, so yeah, you can control for that a little bit. For example, yes, things like, extroversion, I guess neuroticism to some extent, it does correlate with physical strength and size. So that's probably that, it's part of it. And probably the learning that you are vulnerable probably feeds into that. So I think you could, at the same time, some factors like, I know, sex hormones, like testosterone, just, one of them has physical effects. So it actually makes you stronger. And also, affects your psychology. So affects your emotions, makes you probably less anxious, less fearful. And so just finding a correlation doesn't mean that it's the physical size that causes, say, anxiety and fear. I mean, there could be factors that just make you simultaneously stronger and less fearful, or vice versa. So, and even during evolution, of course. So the idea is, well, there's a bunch of things there, but it's not really that men would not benefit from protecting themselves more. The thing is, they have to trade that off against other things they do. And so, for example, competition, especially aggressive competitions or things that, take risk taking, you have to kind of lower the threshold. And the idea is, for women, you don't have the trade-off. The other thing is, which I think is a central aspect of this whole thing about self-protection, is, well, essentially men, so to reproduce, men don't need a lot of physical integrity. So potentially you can, cut off a lot of a man's body and can still reproduce. Okay. Pregnancy is not like that. So pregnancy really takes a well-functioning body because it stresses all the systems like bones, circulatory system, takes a lot of metabolic effort. So one idea there is that essentially women, because of the role in carrying, right, the baby and giving birth, actually injuries to the body have more ramification in females than males for reproduction.
Yeah.
So yes, and so that's probably one of the sources of this, why the costs of getting injured or getting harmed are higher for females, and then the self-protection. And but at the same time, when you start doing that, right, if you evolve to compete, let's say women evolve to compete less in the physical domain, that also means they're going to, invest less, let's say, in physical size, in muscle, because that's a cost, it's a useless cost and you can invest in other things. So physical size and strength and the emotions and the psychology that goes with it, if they co-evolve, they're not so easy to take apart and say this causes that and this, because you expect them to evolve a bit like a package. So postpartum, so that's, well, from the perspective of psychopathology, that's a very strange and interesting time, because you do have all sorts of, again, strong emotions, life changes, people sleep less for a number of reasons. There's probably something that just related to the hormonal changes. And then the baby, of course, keeps you up, many times. So there's a number of things that change people's life in very strong ways. There's big hormonal changes from before. The baby as a stimulus, in a way, can actually trigger all sorts of new, responses and emotions and so forth. So that's an incredibly consequential moment in people's life. And most people are familiar with postpartum depression. So yes, the time after giving birth, it's a vulnerable time for depression. But not just that. For example, there's something like postpartum mania. So, which is also, it's interesting because one of the things that happen after giving birth is people get very activated. Like they don't sleep. They kind of, there's a bit of nesting. So you start maybe, I don't know, rearranging the furniture or preparing and getting ready and having, spending a lot of mental energy thinking about the baby, what you can do for the baby, are you doing everything right? And that's probably very adapted to be so, focused. But you also have this kind of increased level of energy that most of the times actually gets through what is objectively pretty stressful time. And in some women that goes, that serves as a trigger for a manic episode, and it's kind of the beginning of a bipolar disorder. So it can go either to the depressive side, but also the manic side. And that's also a vulnerable time for OCD.
Yeah.
Again, because physiologically, having a baby gets you to start worrying about stuff you didn't even know it, you didn't know existed before. So, as if you know what I'm saying. And it's interesting because OCD, there's, one of the time people start OCD is in childhood, or childhood OCD, childhood onset. And then in adults, having a baby, having a kid is actually a trigger for people. So maybe, someone with a little predisposition but no symptoms, then you can start getting, and it can go on all sorts of ways. It can be about contamination,
That's a classic.
Right. But it can have to do with fears of harming the baby.
Yeah.
Right. Obsessions where you start thinking, maybe, I don't know, the baby's crying and kind of you're getting nervous and you start thinking, I could strangle the baby. Right. And that, a lot of people have this kind of brief ideation, but for some people that can become the beginning of an obsession and feed into. And I remember when I was studying this, it was an interesting seminar, a guy who specializes in OCD, and he was giving the example of a person who started to have all sorts of fears about getting into a car, flying, all these sort of kind of phobic, obsessive things. And that happened like bang, like nothing before. And then after having the first kid, it started to go into this kind of protective overdrive. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff going on. It's a very, very, very intense, emotionally intense, physiologically intense, and for that reason, it's a trigger for some things. Not everything. So depression, mania, OCD, and that again makes sense if you think, what is changing? Not everything is changing, but there are some areas where people really experience these huge changes, and that's where you get the vulnerability.
And it gets us into this really tricky question, which doesn't obviously just apply to the evolutionary view on psychopathology, which is, are these things disorders or not? Because it's obviously unpleasant to be, say, constantly checking that your baby's breathing, washing your hands a lot, or whatever kind of classic postpartum craziness. But it's unpleasant for the mother, but as long as it's not completely out of hand, it's not bad for the baby. If anything, it's good for the baby. Like, it's adaptive. You can see why it would be adaptive as long as it's not so excessive. And so at what point do we draw the line and say this is a disorder? This applies to absolutely everything.
Right,
obviously there are very few conditions which are clear cut.
Many things. Here's the other thing about psychopathology, which is there's a clinician side. That's a very interesting general thing about when you're talking about psychopathology in general. The clinicians see people with the bad luck.
Yeah.
Because many disorders, people can kind of get them briefly and then they go away. And in most cases, that's what happened. Even with something as serious as psychosis, think psychosis, like the most impairing and damaging and kind of scary mental disorder. Actually, if you just look at the patients, this is what you see, right? You see patients who have a breakdown and then they have, catastrophic symptoms and changes, impairments in their lives and so on. But it's interesting because people have been starting to follow up people who have signs of that they are high risk for psychosis, for example, because a relative had it, or they have they manifest some traits that, little tendency to hallucinate a bit, having this kind of magical thinking, maybe a bit of paranoia, right? So people, for various reasons, they are at high risk for developing psychosis, and they are. I mean, they're much more likely than the rest of the population. But if you follow them, and even most of them never get anything, and actually the people who do, who maybe have at some point something that actually grades into a diagnosable disorder, in many cases that resolves without a lot of impairment. So you go back to essentially back normal. Same for, a lot of people have, mild bipolar, and they never go see a doctor or see a psychologist. OCD, to some extent, the symptomatology can be something that comes in, especially in things in moments of transitory life change, like postpartum. You can start having this kind of weird, oh my God, I'm OCD, I need to wash my hands and this, and then maybe after a month or two, it just naturally kind of goes away. And that's probably an easier case to make, that what you see is just, slightly exaggerated version of something that basically, normal and physiological. But if you look at things from the clinician's perspective, you always see the people who were, unlucky enough that the disorder didn't resolve. Maybe they had, they were more vulnerable. They had just a worse case for whatever reason. They didn't cope as well. And so things look very different if you look at them from the perspective, okay, from normality to disorders or vice versa. And that's actually relevant, because when you're trying to decide, right, what is a disorder, but first you need the definition of disorder. I won't go into that in any detail, but so what's a disorder, right? Because it could be, you have different conceptions, and one conception is statistical, and it's basically anything that goes far away from the norm enough is a disorder. It's just unusual in a very weird, very unusual, that's a disorder. Which this is not exactly how people think, because what about traits that are especially good, right, desirable? Yeah. It's not like, maybe you're a bit weird, sure, but it's not that people say, oh yeah, but it brainy disorder.
Or being highly agreeable or something like that. We don't think that's exactly a disorder.
I mean, you might, and even if, it's interesting because there was Randy Nessie, when you look at people who have a lot of, say, anxiety, fear, people who are very, high in negative emotions, and it's kind of, okay. And they, because of the nature of the thing, they often go to see a doctor or psychologist and seek treatment. But the thing is, you have a whole distribution. So there must be people who are too low. I mean, abnormally low in those rates, right? Where are they? And the thing is, at first, they probably are not going to the doctor. Yeah. Maybe they die anyway, because if you really have, or you get into bad situations, but if you have like a abnormally high threshold for risk and danger and, anxiety, it's likely that you would end up in some really dangerous occupations, and maybe, so there's a danger in there. So there are negative, say, side effects, but you're not going to seek help first. And there's basically no diagnosis in the whole DSM that has to do with the absence of negative emotions. There's only one. There's only one that, if you look, you come through DSM and say, okay, let's find a disorder where the problem is not having too many negative emotions, but having too few. And there's only one, which is, I don't remember the exact label. It's basically about children who have like indiscriminate attachment. So they don't fear strangers. They get, attached to strangers, like if they were family members. And of course they get in trouble for that. And so that's the only, diagnostic category where it's essentially the kids should be more fearful, and they're like indiscriminate, don't pay attention to signs of danger, strange adults, and so on and so forth. But there must be someone who's, mania in a sense maybe is a bit like that. But then again, you only diagnose it when it does other things to you. So if you're just manic, then of course, if you put yourself in danger, yes, and maybe there's some kind of psychotic break with reality and all sorts of things. But see, if you only have, say, mild manic episodes in your life, you're probably not going to see a doctor unless you also get depressed. So that's, it's interesting. So what is a disorder?
Yeah.
So statistical abnormality probably has something to do with it, but it's not the whole story. Most people, when they think about disorder, the idea you have is that something is not functioning right. And that's basically, this Jerome Wakefield, essentially his proposal is one of the most influential definition of what is a disorder, because we want to pinpoint that in medicine as well, right? Is there's a dysfunction. Okay, so there's a mechanism that's not working as it should.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is, okay, how should it work? And to know that, you have to have a good understanding of what's the kind of design function of that mechanism. Is it, because sometimes you can mistake something else for a dysfunction. You might think, okay, this is not working as it's supposed to be, and actually it is working as it's supposed to. You're just misunderstanding the nature of the mechanism. So that's tricky, and it requires a lot of a solid understanding of the underlying biology, the evolutionary functions, and so on and so forth, which for a lot of psychological mechanisms we don't have at the level of analysis. So we're kind of struggling a bit. And then the second component of Wakefield says a dysfunction is not enough to create a disorder in people's mind. It has also to be perceived as bad for you, bad for society. So there must be kind of a social consensus that thing is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And then when you combine those things, so when you think, okay, something is broken plus it's bad, okay, that's a disorder. That's kind of the concept underlying when we make a decision, is this a disorder or not? And so from that perspective, you can have a lot of things that are malfunctions, but they're not considered disorders because the consensus is not like that. Or you could have these functions that are, well, it gets complicated. So for example, it's not just about it's an evolutionary concept, but it's not all about fitness, right? It's not just about, is this adaptive or not? Because some things can be, for example, put in old age, they get all sorts of, again, malfunctions. For example, your eyes works, your bones maybe break, or your joints. And so the idea is, even if it doesn't impact your reproduction or your fitness, that's still a mechanism that is not working the way it's supposed to be. There's a design criteria. So you have to know what is designed for. For example, joints are designed to allow your bones to move in a certain way. And if you can't move the bones in a certain way, that's a dysfunction. And if people consider it to be a bad thing, then okay, we have a certified disorder. But it's a definition that a lot of people are not happy with this definition because it has a subjective element to it. On the other hand, it also requires an appeal to design that also people are, the statistical definition is kind of very neutral. As long as it's very unusual, we can all agree. And if you're talking about this kind of harmful dysfunction criterion, there's 2 points of debate. One is, okay, how do we know the function so that we can say that there's dysfunction? And then what about the subjective element? I'm one of the people who think that Wakefield is about right, but there's a lot of, this is just to highlight the complexity of the whole thing. So, and from an evolutionary perspective, there's, I think, a reasonable case that some things that are classified as disorders, as mental disorders, might not be dysfunctions. And so a lot of them probably are. Part of the story is that many, if not most, diagnostic categories, say in the DSM, are quite heterogeneous in terms of severity, in terms of the exact symptoms. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in there, which means there is room for some of the things that you call, for example, depression. Some of them are probably, unpleasant but normal reactions to something bad that happens to you. And there's probably a good reason why people become depressed after certain things or in certain life situations. And then it's also likely that some manifestations of depression are just the mechanism getting, dysregulated or broken or sensitized to a level that is, unhealthy. And the problem is, especially for something like depression or anxiety, is where to draw the line.
Yeah.
And there have been some attempts, though. So it's not impossible to try to draw the line, but it's not just about severity. It's not just about, okay, up to this point, it's fine. And because it can be that people get some, pretty severe depression, for example, that is temporary, resolves, and they're fine again. And it was probably a reaction to things like, I don't know, grief, someone dying, or very hard life conditions, losing a job, or things like that. And there used to be exceptions, The DSM is weird because there used to be exceptions, for example, for bereavement, right, up to the DSM-4.
Yeah, famously.
And
yes.
then they took it away. So there's debate there as well.
Yes.
There's this quest for consistency, for internal consistency of the system, but mental disorders are very strange things, and there's probably a lot of very qualitatively different stuff that goes in there.
It presents this challenge as well about treatment, because I suppose I remember having a conversation with a psychiatrist about this.
Yes.
As a clinician, how do you feel about the philosophical issues relating to what is and it's not a disorder? And he said, well, I sort of take the view that if my patient wants this treated,
right.
then I see no good reason not to do so, then I just do it. I don't need to get too bogged down in the theory when I'm just faced with the patient before me with, say, something like depression. But I guess there are, and so you might say with the bereavement exception, if someone comes to you and they are depressed because they are bereaved, and they may or may not meet the DSM criteria, but depending on which edition you're talking about, but if you can treat them with whatever you have in your bag of tricks, is there a good reason not to? There's no real harm in giving them, say, SSRIs, so maybe you should just give them SSRIs. I guess one instance, though, where that wouldn't be true is if actually the thing that is causing that, there's nothing you really can do about bereavement, unfortunately, but there are instances where people might be depressed because of something in their life, say they're in an abusive relationship, might be an example. Yes. And actually SSRIs are not, they might soften the emotions, but they're not going to deal with the problem, which is actually you need to get out of this relationship. And there might be other examples of that. So there's a risk of when you biomedicalize something, which actually is more to do with evolutionary mismatch.
Yes.
Let's say.
So yeah, that's it's very complicated. I mean, I'm not trying to resolve this, right? But yeah, maybe I can highlight a couple of reasons why this is so complicated.
Yeah.
And one reason is that if you think about the evolved logic of something like depression or anxiety or fear, you have to start thinking in terms of false positives and false negatives. So all these protective mechanisms have some, you have to accept some malfunction, or not malfunction, but some misfires, right? It's the same for your immune system. Your immune system is not designed to wait until it's, let's say, 100% sure that there's a bad infection going on. So essentially, as soon as you get some chemical cues that maybe there's an infection somewhere, it just kicks into inflammation, right? Take inflammation. It's not unlike depression in a sense, because a very generic kind of thing. Actually, they're connected, because there's inflammation can actually lead to depression and vice versa. So there's some physiological connection there too. Inflammation is regulated in a way that it's not, sometimes you get fever and inflammation and whatever for essentially no good reason. So it's not always necessary. Okay. And the way you want to design a system like that is to allow for some of that. So it's the perfect immune system is not an immune system that never, gets, starts inflammation for no good reason. You actually have it's like a fire, the Randy Ness again, but it's the smoke detector. The perfect smoke detector is a smoke detector. Sometimes will just, go off randomly, even if there's no fire. Why? That's because then you're sure that when there's a fire, it's going to go off. If you set it too low, then yes, you don't get the random activations, but you also don't get the safety. That makes things like depression and other anxiety disorders very tricky, because even if the system is functioning right, the way it's designed to function, you expect sometimes it's going to go off for no good reason. So just see, just if you just see that people, for example, sometimes get depressed and seemingly without, a good reason, that doesn't mean that it's broken. It's very tricky. So that's specific to this kind of disorders, but it makes the analysis so much more complicated. That's one reason why it's, so drawing the line is even harder, because it's not like there's a clear criterion of when it's, even some malfunction, let's say, doesn't mean the system is broken. It could be part of the way the system is regulated. That's also the reason why you can probably, overtreat, even if the reaction sometimes is helpful to people and adaptive. And there's a big debate, again, not trying to resolve it, about the possible function of rumination. Thinking repetitively about your whatever, could be your present situation and how bad it is and what you could do about it, errors you made in the past and things like that. Now, is this helpful sometimes? Now, the problem is It's hard to say, because first, a lot of people probably ruminate and never get depressed, and clinicians don't see them. So clinicians mostly see the people who ruminate in a way that's special, in a sense. No, they ruminate maybe in a way that's unproductive. It's quite possible there are some people who ruminate, but they do it in a more productive way and actually helps them, but they don't go to the psychologist. So there's complications there. And then other people say, no, rumination is just maladaptive in general, so it's not a useful way of dealing with problems. And there's people doing studies trying to show one or the other. But leaving that aside, the thing is, it's just like fever. You can take fever medications and you don't die, right? Even if fever. So we can probably agree that fever in general is an adaptive part of your immune response. It's not a disease, right? It's a symptom that's actually helping you fight infection. So fever is adaptive. However, people medicate fever all the time and they're mostly fine. So maybe, I think actually there's maybe one study, they did a big meta-analysis, and there was a slight mortality increase if people take fever medication. So it's actually, maybe it's slightly harmful over the long run and the big numbers. But in general, you can take medication. And in this case, it's a mismatch, because of course, now we can medicate fever more because we have, say, antibiotics. Do you see what I'm saying? So you're not relying entirely on your immune system. So now we live in an environment we can actually take antibiotics, and so the whole fever, fire show, it's of course unpleasant. It has costs and so on. So you can shut it down a little bit, take antibiotics. So you're essentially, it's a dual mismatch. So you're shutting down something that's an adaptive response, but at the same time, the environment is changed. So you don't strictly need that all the time, and you can shut it down. And you could say maybe something similar with respect to depression and other anxiety symptoms. It's possible that, because they're maybe designed to go off maybe a bit more than they should, if you just medicate them, most of the time it's not hard. And it's also possible that the environments we live in actually don't require that much self-protection in, for example, the social sphere. And people who, I don't know, there could be a little mismatch there. For example, if people evolved in very small groups, so if you do something, you do something and people shame you, do something shameful, and people reject you, and so that's really bad, because that's your one group. So if people start rejecting in your village, let's say, you're pretty much done. Or you have to do, that's a serious situation. It's a really bad so it's very dangerous from a social perspective, and you should do really something about it. And maybe that's where you get these exaggerated responses to being shamed and so forth. On social media, no one really cares, right? In the end, or in a big, anonymous society where you can, okay, your friends shame you and reject you, fine. I mean, maybe you find new friends. So there's an argument that the kind of society we created recently actually makes some of these self-protective bad emotions a bit less useful on average. And that's also why you can medicate them more. That's one way to think about it.
I've heard an interesting comparison here with road rage in a city. So say you're driving, this is much more of an issue for men.
Right.
But if a man is, cut up by a driver in a big city, and he feels this overwhelming sense of rage and needing to take his revenge on this person and assert dominance and so on, that feeling
for my clan.
Exactly right. So that feeling is coming from us being adapted to small, quite like socially static groups, and where actually another man in the group challenging your dominance like that is a very serious thing, and you need to deal with it right now, because otherwise you might be knocked off your perch. But obviously you're never going to see this bozo again. So actually in the here and now, you don't need to go over and reestablish the proper hierarchy. You can just let him drive away.
Right. You think when I think it really applies, and we really did something weird with development, is children and teenagers.
Yeah.
Because by design, your group of friends is going to change. Your social group is going to change, because go to elementary school with some kids, and then different set of kids in middle school, then a different set of kids and so actually we design things in a way that your social group basically changes every few years. And maybe if you're in a small place, maybe there's more overlap, but if you're in a big-ish city, you might never see your elementary school friends again. And that's very, it's the standard way in, say, weird societies, but until very recently, that would have been very strange. The thing is, the kids you're growing up around your age, and the older kids and so forth, you're basically stuck with them.
Yeah.
More or less. And so, of course, feeling, rejected or slighted, or all this concern with popularity and how other kids see you. Of course, they make more sense if you think that people were essentially, with exceptions, but more or less stuck with the kids. Just imagine being stuck forever with your elementary school classmates. That's the situation in most small scale societies. The kids you're growing up with, they're the people you're going to compete with and mate with, alliances and friends for essentially forever. And so, of course, the stakes are higher for all these kind of social dynamics. And of course, you see a lot of the social media amplify this even more. But in reality, that's not true anymore. It's very temporary. But he tried to convince a middle school kid that it's temporary. That's very, very hard. We're not adapted to that. So I think that this kind of weird mismatch, but it's a mismatch that, in a way, makes people more vulnerable to certain things, but it's also an opportunity in a sense, because people are actually not stuck. And so, the flexibility you have in changing your social group, there's some risks and some downsides, but there are also some upsides.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.